I have kept the topic very broad to give you a bird's eye view because of the shortness of time, and we can discuss the details later. The story of modern India actually begins in the 16th century. The latest research has actually established that Mughal Empire was in fact modern. And there are many parameters of modernity, and one of the parameter is monetization of the economy. Right? Everything dealing in cash. And how did Mughal Empire become so rich? In fact, it inherited a very rich India already. But in the 16th and 17th century, there was a tremendous influx of gold and silver bullion from the Americas, which was literally looted by the Europeans after the destruction of the great Inca and Aztec capitals of Tenochtitlan and Cuzco. Something like insane amount of 25,000 tons of silver, 1,000 tons of gold, entered into the world economy. And the whole world became global, really. And it was during this time that India and China were these two huge manufacturing giants. They had a big artisanal, base of export-oriented commodities. They were producing like textiles, silk. There was a iron and steel, production, export. There was shipping. There was pharmaceuticals. There was also pepper exports. So these were high-value commodities which were highly priced in the international market. And the people would, the artisans were, this was a seller's market. So the seller would demand cash, basically. So cash circulated throughout the Mughal Empire. In fact, wages were paid in cash, taxes were paid in cash. So the richer society became even more richer. And, by 1800, India and China were dominating Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean region. Trade. I'm not going to go into China because it's not really directly related to us, but we'll be giving the references because China and India were competing. So by 1800, historians have calculated that 50% of the total global GDP was contributed by these two economies, two countries. And they were economies of scale, almost like 600 million population, demographic base, with a very highly efficient agriculture to back industries. All kinds of enterprises were booming. And the Indian artisans will be able to produce high-value commodities for global market because of their skills, which they have developed almost 3,000 years from the time of Indus Valley. Right? So this is not just 1 or 2 centuries progress we are looking at. Now, Indian Ocean and also Western Pacific was an open zone of trade. There was no navy, there was no piracy, there was no smuggling activity, there was no looting of ships, nothing. There were hajj pilgrimages would go every year from Indian subcontinent all the way to Jeddah and Persian Gulf. Indian shipping was, navigating in the East African coast, then towards interface with the Bay of Bengal. You had Southeast Asia was a big Borobudur temple, the biggest stone temple in the world, has still this stone carvings of Indian ships, sailing ships, which would go all the way to Hangzhou in China. Right? And Indian economy was open economy. Basically, the Mughals, did not tax the market. They said it's open market. Anybody who has good stuff to sell can come and sell and participate in the market. It was only agricultural revenues which the Mughal Empire taxed. So what was happening was then in the 18th century, unfortunately for India, and China, unfortunately for the Europeans, the Mughal Empire has, basically declined, disintegrated into regional successor states. And these regional successor states oftentimes you know, clashed with each other to expand their territories, expand their revenue base. You had Mysore, you have Marathas, you had Nawab of Karnataka, Nawab of Bengal, Awadh, Punjab. Mughal emperor himself was basically reduced to a small enclave in Delhi. Right? And he didn't care, really, because everybody recognized his suzerainty, even though his authority didn't exist. So, in these troubled waters, the European East India companies, Dutch, French, English, started intruding. And how did they do that? They had already a lot of experience of piracy and looting in the Atlantic Ocean. They had loaded cannons on the ships and they became warships, basically. Indian ships never had any firepower, cannons, even though they were cannons in India. They didn't load them up because the Indian Ocean, is safe. So when these intruders entered into the Indian Ocean, they changed the entire, demography, entire architecture of the Indian Ocean. They started saying, okay, if a Hajj pilgrimage is going from, say, Cochin to Jeddah, you have to pay, you have to carry a license. Otherwise, we are going to loot. We are going to plunder, right? If a ship launched from, say, Surat to Zanzibar in East African coast, you have to buy a pass. If you don't, we are going to plunder, we are going to bombard, we are going to. So you have the beginnings of European, imperialism, which really begins in the ocean. And then what they do is they set up key, key ports. They call them enclaves in East African coast, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean is named after the Indian Peninsula. It's a big, huge territory on both sides. Surat, Masipatam, Coromandel coast, Malabar coast, Cochin, other way. Okay, so they were, and then all the way to Malacca and Hangzhou in South China Sea, and all the way into Japan. Right? So they had placed their foothold in these regions, and we'll be focusing mostly on India here. And they started building fortifications. And already the political situation was very volatile in the 18th century. In fact, 18th century India was very well developed. Tipu Sultan's state was a highly efficient state, can be compared to any state in the world. So, what they would do is they would then fortify, these enclaves, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, which were just fishing villages, really small, in the 17th century. And then they would recruit local young men, young boys from the countryside, who always was in need of cash, and raise them in European drill, give them European uniforms, European type weapons. This is all, artillery and infantry, whereas Mughal tradition was primarily cavalry. Right? So this was a totally different type of a colonial army we're talking about. And then they would hire these as mercenaries for political and trade concession, in exchange for political and trade concessions. So this was a bridgehead for the European East India companies. First the Dutch came, then they were fighting for India trade, in fact. And by 18th century, East India Company has driven the Dutch and the French out and established their control of Bengal, which was the richest province of the Mughal Empire. The wealth of Bengal was amazing. It had a huge population, almost 1/3 of the total population of India. Gujarat was another big production center. Malabar coast, Coromandel coast was another big production center. So they basically tapped into these highly, organized markets where they could get these high value goods at very, very, low prices. And once they control the market, then the merchant or the weaver or the dyer would basically lose control over their commodities. It became a buyer's market in the 18th century. So then what happens is that something really happens. So the rich province of Bengal is looted. Karnataka is basically, his arm is twisted, and extract revenues from him. Primarily it was a private giant stock company. They had to give dividends to their shareholders, and these dividends were sometimes 200%, 300%, sitting in London, stock markets. And where does all this revenue come from? Obviously from India. So what you have here, the beginning of the rise of British colonial exploitation of India begins from 1757 in the classic. And the exploitation, the revenue extraction was so high that within 10 to 12 years, there was a massive famine in Bengal, 1770 famine, which has been reported. Almost 1/3 of the total population of Bengal was wiped out. Literally wiped out. 10 million people were talking. So you have the beginning of systematic cycles of depredation and degradation of Indian state. Now in 1790s, something really interesting happened, or in the late 18th century, something really interesting happened in Europe. What the Europeans did was they basically took the skills of weaving, of spinning, of dyeing from the Indian weavers, from Benares, from Calcutta, from Machilipatnam, from Deccan, from Madras, from Surat and Gujarat. They took those skills, which they had developed over a period of 3,000 years, and then took it to Europe. And then what they did was they put it to mechanical power. All this time, Indian weavers were producing very high quality yarn and cloth and silk using manual power. Sometimes, even animal power for agriculture. But once they were able to very successfully translate these skills, they were able to manufacture this on a mass scale in Lancashire, in Manchester, in Leeds. Yeah, that's it. And then dump it in India. They didn't have to pay any tariffs. The Mughal Empire, there was a little bit of tariffs, but here now they control the provinces. Right? So they were bringing in these cloth and taking out raw material from India, underselling the Indian artisanal clothes. And within 1790 to 1820, you had such a large deindustrialization of India that Indian weavers and dyers had no other employment but to fall back on agriculture. Agriculture can absorb only that much in terms of generating employment. Right? Previously, agriculture would support industries and supply finished goods. That chain, the supply chain system was basically broken. So then you have British then between 1757 and 1957, 1757 to 1850s, they systematically conquer the whole of India using enormous force and violence. Right? Marathas were defeated. Tipu Sultan was defeated. Punjab were defeated. Bengal was already conquered. And then what they did was they said, okay, in the new dispensation, in the new colonial bureaucracy, so what you have here is between 1750, so they have systematically conquered the whole of India, and what they did was they started imposing conditions saying that if you want to work for colonial bureaucracy, colonial civil service, British civil service, then all your language of Persian, Urdu, Hindi and other regional languages which they used to use before during the Mughal period and in the 18th century is no good. You have to learn English. Only then you can work in the imperial world. So what you have here is within all the Persian speak, these highly qualified students and teachers and professors, they lost out. They didn't have any more jobs, nothing to do. These are intellectuals, right? And then, what they did was they introduced survey and settlement operations. Colonial survey and settlement operations. They said, now all this land belongs to the government and we are going to issue pattas on the condition that every patta holder, colonial patta holder, will have to pay revenues, taxes. And if you don't pay taxes, then your land will be seized and that will be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Right? So the former talukdars and zamindars and former landholders of the pre-colonial period also lost out. They said, we are traditional holders of the family. Even in fact, they even took up all the waqf, the lands given to scholars, land given to masjids, land given to saints, lands given to temples. They also were seized. So you have this bureaucratic pre-colonial, civil service, educated intellectual class, which has basically lost out in the colonial period. Right? And then obviously artisans were very unhappy. Merchants were dealing with cloth. Now you had a British monopoly here. Right? The Indian capital basically was dominated by the European capital. So the merchants lost. And then obviously, the empire was built on extracting as much revenue as possible from the peasants, which was the biggest section of Indian society. And the peasants were unhappy. And then there was a scare among the sepoys. And sepoys were very, very horribly treated in the British colonial army. Like, for example, a sepoy may be very senior and may have served 30, 40 years and have fought in many, many battles, but he could never become an officer. Why? All officers have to be only white. So we had this racial tension between sepoys and the whites. And oftentimes, these officers really did not, respect the religious sentiments of these sepoys, who were both Hindus and Muslims. And there was always a scare of Christianization, because the evangelical Christians tied themselves to the colonial state. And they were setting up churches, and they were trying to propagate. So there was this really a scare of Christianization and losing your religion, which is a very sensitive issue in India even today. So when the 1857 rebellion happened, even though it was triggered by the sepoys in May, when they revolted against the officers and rode historically to Delhi and declared even Vajrotsava as the emperor, it soon became a general civil uprising. Every section of the society who were disenfranchised because of the colonial setup, new colonial setup, rose up. And within 6 months of the revolt, outbreak of the revolt, entire North and Central India went out of the control of the British. Why? Because all sections, all religious groups came into existence. And actually, you can say that Mughal emperor, issued a farman in the June and July of 1857, stating that we are going to have a government which will hear the voices of every section of the society who have been affected by this white Firangi rule. So we are inviting representatives from every section, and I'll just be a kind of a symbolic authority, and you will be running the state. So you have a beginning of, say, some kind of a constitutional setup here. Even though the 1857 rebellion was brutally suppressed, because the sepoys didn't have access to technology, the Europeans were able to muster troops on steamships from Europe. Then they had railways and telegraph, which sepoys didn't have access to that. And it was the rebellion was absolutely brutally suppressed. Whole villages around Delhi, Banaras, Kanpur, Meerut were burnt to ashes. People were thrown in the fire alive, and hundreds and thousands of people were hanged right in front of the villages. The whole thing is to send a message of terror. Rebel leaders were caught and tied to the mouths of the cannon and blown to bits. And then there was a major change. The East India Company was abolished, and India was now brought directly under the control of the British Parliament. And the office, a cabinet ministry was created, cabinet post was created, Secretary of State for India, and Governor Generals and Viceroys were appointed every 5 years after that. And the whole reorganization of the colonial imperial structure, was put in place. There was a colonial bureaucracy, there was a colonial army, there was a colonial police, the judicial system, which had nothing to do with the traditional Indian system. This was a totally reimposition of Canadian structure. And now you have the beginning of the real ugly face of, Western British imperialism. What they said was, okay, 1857, Hindus and Muslims and all classes united. We cannot allow this to happen ever in India if we want to control them. So then if you look at the colonial documents from 1860s, 1870s onwards, you will see that they systematically divided Indian people on the basis of caste, on the basis of religion, on the basis of race, setting up one group against the other. Right? That was the only way they can actually control it. It's such a huge, massive empire. But the central, and they also started, justifying their conquest and their rule by saying that Europeans, that the whites, are biologically the most evolved people in the world. Those who are not white are not fully evolved humans. They are barbaric, they are savages, they are unscientific, they are superstitious, they are backward. They really don't know, anything about liberties, civil liberties, or freedom. They are unfit for democracy. In fact, they are unfit even to think. So we, have to civilize these people. They are a burden on us, white man's burden, civilizing mission. Right? And then, but if you scratch all this, the underlying bottom line is that the fundamental basis of British Empire in India was extraction of maximum revenues, not only to maintain their empire and take it back to England, enrich Britain, but also to expand their empire from their base in India to Middle East, to East Africa, to Southeast Asia, to China. And British Empire was the biggest empire in modern history. And oftentimes, Indian sepoys were deployed abroad without paying proper bhattas. And when their families died, their bodies were not brought back, they were thrown into the sea. So there was a lot of grievance here, which went into 1857. So then the project of British Imperial project from 1850s, 1860s, 1870s was to maximize the revenues, extract as much wealth as possible, and not worry about religion. Not worry about. And Dvisaptaham recently calculated that between 1757 conquest of Bengal to 1947 partition of India, they took something like $64 trillion in modern USD terms. That is for which the data is available to us. We are not looking at the data, the wealth which was taken out, which was never recorded. So you can say 64, even if you add up to another 1/3, it will be $100 trillion they took out. And to give you just an example, the top 6 economies of the world today, if you add up the GDP of the top 6 economies of the world today, US, you have China, you have Germany, you have Japan, you have UK and India. India is the 6th. Still, it does not add up. It falls much, much shorter than the amount of wealth they took. This is 21st century we are talking about. So you can imagine how much wealth must have gone out of India. And by 1900, India, from being the richest society in the world, had become the poorest society in the world. contributing only like 3% of the total GDP, from 25% to 3%. Tremendous within 100. Never before in the 3,000 years history of India, this was unprecedented. The scale of exploitation was amazing, because British were not really interested in staying in India or developing Indian capital or Indian infrastructure outlays. They were just interested in putting together, implementing an infrastructure for extracting as much revenue. In fact, India became the most taxed society in the world. There was a tax on water, there was a tax on agriculture, there was a tax on land, there was a tax on pastures, forest produce. There was a tax on even internal tariffs. If you want to move goods from Telangana to say Awadh, in Mughal times there were no tariffs. You have to now pay tariffs, right? And Indian goods, Indian merchants, Indian capitalists could not really, export anything without paying heavy tax. So from being an open economy, India became a captive market, basically, catering only to the whims, only servicing the interest of the British economy. And in 1870s and 1880s, something really dramatic happened. Indian rupiah had always been pegged to gold standard and silver standard. The famous Mughal, rupiah, they were mints, which would mint gold and silver coins, and circulated widely during the Mughal Empire. So now they took India off the gold standards and then plugged it to pound sterling. I mean, this was like banditry in broad daylight. And then Indian rupee became basically subservient to the pound sterling. And when you are going to take out so much wealth out of the country and not reinvest anything, then what are you going to have? You're going to have poverty, you're going to have hunger, you're going to have diseases like smallpox, cholera, malaria, plague. They introduced railways, and the railways basically, wherever it went, it spread cholera, which is a waterborne disease. They would dig, pits, cracks, pits to raise the railway beds. The water accumulated in these pits and created conditions of malaria. I mean, these diseases are there in India before, but what was happening was that these diseases were very endemic. Cholera did not never spread to all over India before. Right? It was only endemic. Now it became pandemic, killing millions and millions of people. In fact, historians have calculated that the latest research from 1866 Orissa famine to 1899, all India famine, including Madras, something like 40 million people were dead. They were dying like flies. In fact, famines started in India from 1830s, the great inflation of 1830s. Every 10 years there was one famine, a couple of famines, sometimes in 1860s and 70s there were two famines. Every decade there were famines. Whereas if you look at the pre-colonial period, you will have only one famine a century. Maybe at the most two famines. During Shah Jahan's reign there was one famine, and then during Aurangzeb's reign there was one famine. Two famines in the 80s, 70s. Right? And the state always in the pre-colonial times, going back to the Mauryas, always intervened extensively in dealing with these famines to keep it localized, control the prices, control the distribution, give tax breaks to farmers who have lost their crops, give interest-free loans. But the British, they followed the Adam Smith and Malthusian policies, Malthusian ideologies of non-interference, laissez-faire. People will have to take care of themselves. It's not government's responsibility to take care of people. But when it came to collecting taxes, it was very much interfering. So you have this double standard hypocrisy, which for which millions of people paid through. Now, between 1830, when Macaulay introduced the English education and made it as a mandatory for getting government jobs, that was the only job available really. Within two generations, from 1830 to 1860 or 1870, a whole new, totally new class of Western educated Indians had come into existence. in big cities, colonial cities, like, you have Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, Aligarh, Delhi, Lahore, Karachi. Uh, and this class was really very, very small, but what was the most speciality about the uniqueness about this class was that it was able to communicate over long distances. And they started writing newspapers, they started writing pamphlets and books. They started interacting with each other. Let's put it that. Previously, Bengalis couldn't communicate with Punjabis, Avadis could not communicate with the Tamilians, and the Marathis could not communicate with Assamese. India was too big, right? Even though the class was very small and it grew up in colonial cities and towns, it was a very vocal class. And it said, we represent India. We represent the interests of people who cannot speak for themselves. And what did they say? They actually, said that if we want to really fight the British, we have to first defeat them with ideas and ideologies. Only then we can build really a strong, powerful movement. Right? So our responsibility is to have a long-term perspective. Bipin Chandra talks about the long-term dynamics of Indian nationalism. What do? They actually gather enormous economic statistical data to show that the reason for India's poverty and backwardness is the British colonial exploitation. You had these very powerful thinkers and economists and writers from 1860s. Pura Sabha was formed. They formed associations. From 1860s onwards, they sent reporters into famine areas to report. So the latent phase of Indian nationalism, Indian national consciousness, begins with economic nationalism. I'm not going to go to the details of this. There were giants who wrote about this. Interestingly, Karl Marx also was writing in Germany and Europe at this time. He never paid any attention to Indian nationalist, thinkers who were writing about it. If he had, then he would have revised his Marxist thesis. So you had the latent phase where you are not going to directly clash with the British politically, but we are going to present an ideological critique and attack on the very foundations of British Empire. What is the role of railways? Why are there so many diseases in India? Right? Why is British Empire not investing in India's irrigation and agriculture? Why is it not investing extensively in Indian people's education and health? These are the kind of questions they were raising. And they were collecting data. Some of them even went to England to study statistics, study, theoretical, economics, study, quantum, computing, quantum, measuring budgets, export-import data, tariff data, wage price data, population data. These were not some, hocus-pocus intellectuals who were writing about it. These are very powerful intellectuals. So once the economic foundations, the critique of colonial state was established, put in place, then what they did was, then the next generation of Indian, political activists and thinkers and nationalists, they started saying that, yes, now we have the data, now we know why India is so poor, now we know that why we are slaves to the British. Now we have to actually start, the next stage, that is, we have to start asking questions as to why are we using British-made products and goods which we were producing for thousands of years before. Why are we buying cloth from the British? Why are we buying, what happened to our great wood steel manufacturing, industry? What happened to our shipping industry? What happened to our furniture? Why are we buying leather goods, even chappal from here? So we have to become self-sufficient by beginning to manufacture it ourselves. In fact, there was a huge movement in 1905 called Swadeshi, whose main, aim was to become self-sufficient. There were other militant nationalists. This is the militant nationalist phase of Indian national movement starts in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, when they started saying, look, The Europeans are ruling over us and they are doing a bad job of it. Look at poverty. They don't care about our people. What if we rule ourselves? We will have definitely a better government, because this government is going to, you know, focus on the welfare of the people. They started coining the phrase like Swaraj, self-rule. We need to have self-rule and we should become self-sufficient. We don't need British. And some of the really more radical militants started throwing bombs and started shooting, British officers. Right? And this movement, this more militant phase, really was still restricted only to the cities, colonial cities, big cities where Western educated Indians were located. They had not touched yet. The vast majority of the people were still sleeping. Right? Peasants, tribals, pastured, people, women. They were still in a sleeping cell. But in the 1920s, there is a tremendous transformation in the Indian nationalist movement when it becomes a mass movement. 1921-22, 1922-22, Khilafat, they call it. Hindus and Muslims came together. And women came out by the millions, singing and coming out of their houses. So you had the boycotts of the British goods. You had non-violence, non-cooperation. You had civil disobedience in the 1930s, organizing around even, common goods, commodity like salt and sugar, which the British had monopolized. Can't we produce salt and sugar ourselves? We have been doing this. Right? So there was a protest, huge protest all over. And these were mass movements. 1940-42 during World War II. I mean, 1939 when the World War II began in August or September of 1939, India was forcibly dragged into World War II by the British, saying that, we are fighting for freedom and democracy against fascist and Nazi Germany and, Hitler and Mussolini, who are threatening democracy and freedom in the world. The Indian nationalists were saying, how can we fight for the master's freedom while we ourselves don't have any freedom? When we are ourselves slaves, how can a slave fight for the master's freedom? Makes sense, right? It was logical. Obviously, the entire leadership of the mainstream nationalist movement was put in prison. And literally hundreds and thousands, lakhs and lakhs of people were put in prison during this mass movement phase. There were shootings, there were lathi charges, there were injuries, there were killings. In fact, in 1942, Churchill even ordered the Royal Indian Air Force to bomb, from the aircrafts to basically to disassemble large gatherings of demonstrators and protesters. So then what they did was, okay, what we are going to do is the Indian nationalist movement is becoming a mass movement. We need to do something about it because it is threatening our rule. Same thing which they did in the late 18th century, late 19th century. Divide them up. Set up Muslims against Hindus, Hindus against Muslims. Set up Dalits against, non-Dalits. Same policy of divide and rule, which led to the partition of the country. And the independence came, but it came literally drenched in blood. 1.5 million people were killed. 15 million people were made homeless. This was the largest migration in human history to date. 15 million people is not a small. In Calcutta and in Bengal and Punjab. Right? So you have, this situation in 1947. And in 1947, literally there was nothing. There were no bridges, no proper roads, no railway structure was completely broken. There were no canals, there were no dams, there was, the agriculture was short. There was no army. The British colonial army which India and Pakistan inherited was basically broken. And an economy which really had to be started from scratch. So the National Planning Commission, which was established in the 1930s, basically built from the first brick. So from 1947 to 1989, that was a period when India shut itself off to the rest of the world and had only minimum contact, but developed itself with its own indigenous resources, skills, capital, agriculture, supported industrialization, just like in the pre-colonial period. And industries were developed, transportation system, education system, healthcare system, social infrastructures. India had really very visionary leadership here. And by 1989, 1990, 1991, when the whole digital age started, information technology, satellite communication, artificial intelligence, fiber optics, internet, first computers, laptops, then cell phones. India was ready to really ride this wave with very high tech. IITs, IIM produced hundreds and thousands of engineers who could, write programs at very, very low prices and export software. China was doing the same thing there after the Communist Revolution of 1949. But India and China were now software and hardware giants of the world. So from 1990 to 2022, they are now contributing almost 15 to 20% of the total global GDP, and this trend is going to continue up until they celebrate the centenary in 2047 49, when they will reclaim their status which they had lost in 1800. But what are the challenges which India has to achieve that goal? Right? We have a lot of challenges. Even after 75 years, which we celebrated this year, there is poverty and illiteracy in India. Almost 30% of the India's population is literally, you cannot do anything with them. They work as coolies, they don't have any skills, unskilled labor force, they don't even have food to eat, they have problem of housing there. Illiteracy is 30%, almost 1/3. Whereas China, in this regard, has achieved 100% literacy, and once you have the skilled labor force, you can do anything with them, really. Just like Japan built up after World War II. Economic and wealth inequality, tremendous inequality. You have, rich capitalists who are billionaires. The richest man in Asia is from India. Then you have somebody who doesn't even have a house to live, right? Or working as a shoe repairer under a neem tree. That has to be addressed. Then you have to gender inequality. India has a very, very highly efficient, highly skilled female labor force in every field, and we have not tapped into their full potential up until now. So that challenge is. Then creating decent employment, well-paying jobs for the younger generation. India has an advantage over China because China's population is aging now from 35 to 45. India's population is from 25 to 35 or 20 to 35. It's a very young population. So we have to find jobs for these young people who are graduating on a big scale, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. These are not, these are very highly skilled, education they are getting, right? Then then we have problem of freedom of expression. We need to be fearlessly be able to express our our feelings and our thoughts. There should be no suppression of free expression of thoughts. Only then new ideas will come in every field, in technical field, non-technical field, right? And then of course we need to have responsible leadership and public accountability of leaders who were elected by the people. It's not about just elections, right? And then you have a problem of caste and religion. Religious tension is there. Caste tension between Dalits and non-Dalits. Religious tension between Muslims and Hindus. And you cannot have a tense atmosphere of big communities and castes and expect the economy or country to progress. And then finally, awareness of climate change in all development projects and policies. So once we overcome, we are actually working towards it, and we will eventually get there. and elephant, which is India, will eventually take over the dragon, which is China. But the 21st century, after 1947-49, 2047-49, belongs to India and China, and they will be reclaiming their status. That is how the projections are. So that's where I'll stop.